there's two type of people right now: the people who are just complaining all day long, and the people who actually try to change something, and in the meantime also explain what the problem is. We want to be in the second camp, and it's like, let's do something.
It's like solving a really interesting, complicated puzzle with so many different inputs.
Japan seems to do a lot of things, at least with the right intentions.
Sure.
Like, what are the, what's your thoughts on that?
There's like how many thousands of Ivy League graduates, and then you have like Stanford down the street, and then you have like UC Berkeley, and people who have been doing this who are super hungry, super smart, have been in the industry for years, right? At every single level.
You are not that special. Basically.
You're not that special, right? At all. It's a great life lesson, right? And it's like, I think properly frames your perspective on where you stand in the grand scheme of things. I think there's a part of my brain that's deeply attracted to complexity.
Kenneth, thank you so much for being here with us, man. We met, I think, maybe 8-9 months ago, roughly. I just remember you being like super passionate, open to share, like, just the kind of person who's like, hey, this is what to do, this is who to talk with, like just super open. We had you on one of our events as well. You brought the same kind of energy. And I meet a lot of people who know you, and every time what I hear is like, this guy's awesome. So honestly, thank you for being here. We'll talk about startups today. We'll talk about entrepreneurship, the challenges, and let's do it, man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very kind words. Hope I can live up to them. But yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. It has been quite a few months since we last talked, hasn't it?
Time flies.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah, seriously.
I guess the first question I want to ask you is like, why do you care so much about startups? Like, what's your story with startups, and why Japan as well?
Sure. So I think starting from the very top, right? I'm kind of an accidental startup person. The way I think I frame it to people is that it's not so much that I intentionally got into startups, and more that I became disillusioned with what I was doing before with another passion, at least as a career path. And so startups was something that jumped into to fill the void, right? So in terms of my personal background, at least professionally, I've had two passions in life, right? So the first one was current events and politics and policy.
Okay.
I was the kind of kid who growing up did a lot of Model United Nations, did debate club, always had a copy of the news of Newsweek or The Economist that was combing through. I think my high school classmates can attest to that. And then there was also technology, right? So I was like I was irrevocably nerdy. Loved playing around with computers, loved gadgets, right? Loved digging into these reviews and whatnot. But when time came to like go to college, right? I chose the first path. Instead of becoming a computer science major or something like that, which in retrospect I probably should have, I was an international relations major, right, with the aspiration to join the United Nations or something. And so for the first kind of let's say quarter of my adult life, that was kind of the intention, right? So I went to school for this.
Why you're interested in that? Why you're interested in debates? Like, where does it come from?
That's a good question. I think there was very naturally an interest in those things as somebody who grew up in like a very much like a multicultural household, multicultural background. So I was born in the U.S., right? Kind of lived all over the place, and then moved to Taiwan when I was 7. And as anybody who is familiar with the topic knows, Taiwan is one of the biggest geopolitical issues of our time, right? And I'm also somebody who loves reading, right? And so, like, naturally, every single week, literally, I think from the age of 7 or 8, I was reading about international affairs. And
You were conscious at the age of 7 about the tensions in
no.
Taiwan already? Like,
But I mean,
that's it?
I read whatever was on the coffee table,
Yeah.
right? And whatever the coffee table was,
So whatever the parents are reading, basically.
look, there was like Reader's Digest, which is like something for like middle class households, and then there was like Newsweek, right, or like Time Magazine, right? So I think I also grew up in the generation with you had like 9/11, right? You had conflict in the Middle East. You had also like the kind of post Cold War optimism, where I think personally, I think I belong very much to the generation of people who were told that they could have impact growing up, right? And that you know you should go and change the world, you know, in this very kind of neoliberal neoconservative fervor and optimism about our ability to kind of shape the world and make it a better place, right?
Mm.
I think I ate it all up, right?
It's not a bad thing.
No,
It
not a
sounds like
bad
a
thing.
very good
No,
thing. Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's definitely something that's had a pretty significant impact on like my personal sensibilities, right, to this day, and like why I care so much about the ecosystem rather than just like, you know, I have a job and like my job is to do my job, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the I think that summarized well in sense like you strike me like someone who wants to have an impact. Like you want to you don't just want to like solve a problem, you really want to be part of a bigger solution that allows more people to, I guess, have an impact, so to
Yeah,
speak,
no,
right? This whole
I
ecosystem approach, like
no, I think that's fair. I think it's also gotten me in a lot of trouble.
give me an example.
um Well, I mean, in terms of like, you know, both like personal burnout and also like quite a bit of skepticism from I think my peers and friends who are a little bit more practical in
Mm.
their outlook.
Like what does more practical look like in that sense?
So I think in general, like if we were to introduce a framework here, right? I think there are the people who believe that you can change your environment, and they're the people who believe that their job is to adapt and accept the environment,
Mm.
right? It's like I think in terms of psychological adaptation, like you
Mm.
more or less have to choose one or the other, and like
I guess
and
the
have
third
that
one
like
is
guide your
just to
approach.
move, right?
Yeah, or the third one is
Yeah,
like try to escape, right?
which is that what I did pretty much. That's what
It's
I
like
just left my environment
I
and
mean,
like.
right, or you move to try to find this situation that like best fits you, right?
Mm.
And of course, like I don't think it's that black and white necessarily. In
Of course.
reality, there are parts of both of those in ourselves, but I think at one time or another, like we tend to have beliefs around one of these or the other, right?
Mm.
Have you ever heard of the musical like Hamilton? It's like it's very like raw America, whatever. But like it's basically about like a U.S. founding father named Alexander Hamilton,
Okay.
who was born a, you know, the bastard orphan in the Caribbean, who then rises up in American society and whatnot during the you know, American War for Independence, and then becomes a founding father, and his vagaries and all these, you know, it's very big during the Obama years,
Right.
right? And it kind of expresses this kind of like fervent belief and like optimism about uh essentially like in the musical like country building, right? It's the
Mm.
idea of like country as a startup, right? And like
Interesting.
taking a stand for things, right? And like trying to change the world, yada yada, like standing up for ideals. You
Mm.
kind of running against the brick wall of reality and
Mm.
like the complexities associated with that.
What's your, I guess, definition of a startup as well? Because it might sound like a maybe a weird question, but
Sure,
like I've been in the ecosystem only maybe a year now. Like
sure.
before, I was, I guess, recruiting for more mature companies, and like I was still recruiting for startups, but not that early stage. And like I start meeting a lot of people, and everyone's used that word startup in a different way.
Sure.
Like, what's your definition of a startup? How would
Yeah.
you define it?
So I personally really like the definition of startup. I think that was advocated by one of the founders of 500 startups back in the day.
Mm.
I'm not going to have the exact definition now off, but it's basically the idea is like a startup is a temporary organization whose purpose is to figure out like a scalable and repeatable like product, business model, and like distribution method, right, or something like that. Like, and if it figures out all three of these things,
Mm.
then it ceases to be a startup and then becomes a real business,
Mm.
right? So personally, my view is something around those lines, right? That like startup is inherently an experiment. It's inherently supposed to be a temporary organization that's trying to find a high growth, scalable product and business model,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Mm.
Why Japan? like we didn't get there, but
Why
like why
Japan?
Japan? What brought you to Japan?
Um, so the long story, if we want to go there, is I mean, like as with a lot of other people, I think coming from my background, I think had a lot of exposure to all things Japanese growing up.
Mm,
I'm also Taiwanese, right? Which, if you've met Taiwanese people in general, have a soft spot in their heart for Japan, right? It's like I think it's rare that I meet people who haven't been to Japan like multiple times, right? And so like I think there was always some interest there.
mm,
So when I actually went off to college, and I was interested in learning a third language, very naturally, I think I picked up Japanese, and so it was more or less like a normal subject for me.
mm.
I was like pretty into it, and then I actually studied abroad here
Okay.
after my freshman year of college, way back in 2010. Not to date myself, um, but it was like the funnest summer of my life up to that point, right? So like, I actually didn't travel that much internationally, like growing
Mm,
up, other than like moving back to Taiwan and such. Like I think I'd been to like Hong Kong, I'd been to like mainland China, I'd been back to the U.S. like once, since leaving. So like Japan was like very fresh, right? And like, I hadn't spent that much time in like mega cities like Tokyo. And
mm.
of course, like as a student, Japan's like a fantastic place to be, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of stuck in my mind, and like provide the motivation for me to like continue learning the language. And I think my idea was like I looking around, you look out at a lot of people, and if you don't get the language to a functional level, you kind of lose it.
Yeah.
And so I'm just like, okay, I need to become at least like business fluent in this, and so like devote energy to do that, did GLPT N2 N1.
Nice.
And so long story short, skipping through a couple of different years afterwards, I had the opportunity to come to Japan on a double degree program in graduate school. So I was at Columbia in New York, and they have these like partner programs with a number of universities around the world, kind of like LSE in London, I think Sciences Po in Paris, and then Tokyo, right? I'm just like, holy crap, like
Yeah.
time to live out my weeb dreams or something, right? And looked at it financially as well, and just made sense to come here since the tuition was so much more affordable, and pulled the trigger.
So that brought you to Japan. That when was that?
This was in 2007, 2017. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's been a
Okay.
couple years.
And basically your whole career has been in Japan.
No, so couple of things. So like I actually graduated college in 2013, right? So in between, I worked for 2 years in Thailand and Laos.
Hmm.
As a volunteer, I did a short stint at like a frontier market private equity fund in Mongolia,
Okay.
and I spent some time in DC and New York on various kinds of like consulting type internships. Actually, like very interesting stories. I actually worked for one of the Bill Clinton's former Secretary of Defense, right? And, like during the beginning of the Trump administration, right?
Okay.
And so had a lot of interesting kind of people visit from the Senate, like ambassadors and whatnot, and got to talk to them.
Walk us through the job here. What exactly? Like private equity was that what it was or like?
No, so this was like a international market entry consulting firm called
Okay.
the Cohen Group, right? Named after Bill Cohen. You can look him up. He was like a Republican who worked for a Democratic president, right? As the Secretary of Defense, right? He was actually, he's still quite active despite his relatively advanced age now. Really interesting guy. Also, like, moonlighted as a novelist. Goes on CNBC. I think he was there. To give him commentary on more recent military conflicts when those erupted.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, like long story short, kind of worked with this DC crowd to help clients and enter and figure out international markets.
interesting.
Yeah, basically based on their expansive network on over the course of that they had accumulated over the course of their government careers. Yeah. Madeline Albright also had a firm called the Albright Stonebridge Group, which did more or less the same thing. Yeah. But that was like a completely different life, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
I was
But I guess it give you already this international taste and understanding of like like market entry and all this kind
Yeah,
of
yeah. I
aspect,
mean,
right?
so like Japan was definitely not like the only part of my life, right? There's like the Southeast Asia thing, frontier markets like Mongolia, the New
Mm,
York, DC scene, right? Which is like very much like establishment America. And that all like predated getting into startups
yeah,
and getting into Japan, frankly.
yeah.
Yeah,
And so, okay, so then you got into this program, got to Japan.
yeah,
That's roughly around
sure.
2017, and then you started working in Japan.
Yes, that's right. So,
What was the first job you did in Japan?
yeah, so the first job I did in Japan was actually working for a seed stage startup called Soko. At the time, I think I was about like the fifth employee, like full time employee that was hired or so. Um, it was basically Airbnb for commercial warehousing, so like a B2B two-sided marketplace startup.
Interesting.
That happened to be funded by 500 Startups Japan,
Okay.
which, if you're familiar, is now it is run by Coral Cap or James Riney
Yeah,
and Yohei at Coral Capital.
yeah.
Yeah,
Is that startup still around now?
it is still around. It's still floating around. I mean, it's been I think a long burn for the team. I still chat with the founder from time to time. We're on good terms. Um, but I absolutely loved it.
And what
Right.
was your role there?
It was pretty diverse. So I eventually was the chief of staff of the organization, which meant that I touched anything from like project slash product management, like internal HR stuff, like trying to figure out our first ESOP, or as well as like international BD, trying to like build our like fundraising and pitch decks and things like that. Um, it was like drinking water from a fire hose. I know that's a little bit of a cliche,
Mm,
uh, but plunged into the world of startups. I absolutely love like the degrees of freedom that you had to like have impact or like do things. I
mm,
think the general attitude, which I appreciate a lot, was like, hey, is there a thing that like do you see a problem, or is there a thing that you want to do? And
yeah.
all I had to do was like talk to the CEO, and he like, yeah, sure, right? And then I could just do it, right?
Mm,
So overall, I also did like a bunch of like content marketing, right? And like stood up in front of a bunch of like Japanese salaryman and like tried to like give some report on like the logistics industry
interesting.
in English and whatever. It was
Most
interesting.
people, you speak about it, such a smile, you love it, and like we try to hire as well for InnoHyve right now, and we often just we look for this kind of people where it's like, hey, we have a bunch of problems and we need people to just solve problems all day long. But most people are not attracted by that. Like the lack of, I guess, a framework, the lack of specific problems to fix is not an attractive thing to most people.
Sure.
Like, why do you feel so excited? What makes you feel like excited about this? Because it's something that most people don't thrive in. Like,
I think there's a part of my brain that's deeply attracted to complexity, and that's kind of also a problem in a sense.
hmm
But like, because startups are so complicated and multifactorial, and there are so many different layers to it, right? um I think I mean it quite literal, almost like on a physical level. Like my brain really really liked that,
hmm
right? And so like it's like solving a really interesting complicated puzzle with
mm,
so many different inputs. And so like it
mm,
definitely like sucked me and drew me in, right?
yeah,
Because like the learning curve is so steep,
yeah,
right? And I think I was at a point in my career where I like deeply wanted that, um,
mm,
and like it was more interesting than like management consulting. So
yeah,
like I had given up my dreams, like I'd gone disillusioned with like working for the government or for like international organizations. And so like I interviewed for a bunch of management consulting jobs, like anybody who is like reasonably ambitious but doesn't know what they want to do.
right,
um and then like this was like so much better than that, right? So then
yeah.
kind of fell in love with it.
Yeah, it resonates because I mean I left, I guess, the bigger agency side like about a year ago, and there it was when I joined. There was already kind of, it was a startup but not really. Well, the people did already the hardest part of the work, I guess.
Sure.
And then starting the InnoHyve and stuff, and often people are like, yeah, like do you enjoy it? Is it easier? I'm like, I don't know if it's easier. I don't know if it's hard or not. It just feels like great. It's so much fun. There's not one day that I'm like, I don't want to do it. It's just, but also every day is different. But when I tell this to people, everyone's like, oh, it must be so stressful. I'm like, nah, man, doing every day the same thing sounds stressful to me. And so it really does resonate with everything you just said.
It's kind of like work as self-expression,
Mm,
right? Is how I would frame it. Which again, some people are like, people in my life are like, that's very unhealthy. You should do other things. And I
yeah,
am trying to like diversify my life so I have like more inputs.
yeah.
But like, I mean, I find myself like perpetually drawn
Hmm.
to a lot of these questions and problems, right? And startups because it's also kind of never ending.
Yeah,
Um, but there's also a lot of fun that comes with that, right? Because it's also
yeah.
like such a fast moving industry.
I wanna go more onto the startup stuff, but like I want to ask you questions like, what do you think of like the whole life balance aspect? Because this is something that I face a lot, where people are like, "Man, your life balance seems so bad," and like, do you have the same issue? Like, is this something that often comes to you? Like,
My view on this has been shifting. I think that is a challenging question
mm-hmm,
to address. And I don't think there is a one size fits all answer to this because
mm,
it's very particular to the particular circumstances of each person's life. I would say that for myself, I enjoy work life integration,
yeah,
where ideally it's like one and the same thing. And I think more or less I've been blessed with the opportunity to have roles that provide me with that amount of, I think, personal autonomy. So, like, I don't think that I'm working
mm,
when I'm necessarily like replying to things on Slack at like 9 p.m. Uh, but I also don't think that I'm slacking if I'm like doing jumping jacks at like 10:30, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it resonates. Like, again, like for me, I just look at it, I'm like, I worked really hard to not distinguish work and life in general, but I'm always busy. I'm always doing something. And I don't really distinguish if it's work, it's life. It doesn't really matter. I just want to do useful stuff that works towards my goals and like.
Yeah, and I
But
mean that's the thing, right? The thing about goals, which is like, I mean, I think I imagine I would spend more time doing other things
mm,
if I found them more satisfying
yeah.
or like interesting or worthwhile. And I've
Mm,
had like a number of different like passions and hobbies in the past as well, right? Like was very very into photography at some point.
interesting.
Um, I used to play a lot of video games, um, and then quit, right?
Why did you quit?
So there are two breakpoints actually. So like in after my freshman year of college, I think I just stopped cold turkey, right? And like it wasn't any particular reason for that.
Mm,
I think I just found them to be much less interesting than
mm,
whatever was going on at school and at work and life.
yeah.
Um, and then I picked video games back up
Mm.
10 years later during the pandemic because you can't leave your house,
I know.
right?
I bought a
And it,
PS5 around that time. I never played with it, but I bought a PS5 around
yeah,
that
yeah,
time.
and then it
So,
was like some sort of like a coping mechanism, right?
yeah.
So I mean, like, I have to admit, like, there's like one game that I play, and then when I try to play any other game, it's just like not that interesting, and I
Mm.
immediately like stop
Which
playing it.
game?
So I played Dota 2.
Okay.
So if you're familiar with that,
Um.
it's
No.
like League of Legends,
Okay. Yeah.
right?
Wanus is
So
probably
so
gonna know
like
this one. Huh?
it's one of those main MOBA games. I mean, in the 2000s there was a song called Dota anyway
Okay.
about the game. It's weirdly addicting.
I heard the name of the game for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like it's the way I look at it, it's kind of like playing chess.
Okay.
Fun fact, by the way, like one of the first experiments that OpenAI did was actually building a team of bots
Yeah.
to create a super strong Dota AI, right? That could beat like the world champions in the game, and they succeeded.
Interesting.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Like I do. The only game I actually play is chess. It's literally the only game.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, if you like video games and then you like chess, I think you'd actually enjoy Dota.
Yeah.
It's also one of those things where like it's extremely complicated to the point that if you're
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
get into the game now, it's basically impossible.
Man, there's so many hobbies that I want to start, and every time it's like, oh, I work so much, and the little time that I have left, like I feel so guilty if I don't spend it with my kid and my wife. So it's like there's no more hobbies in my life at
Which
this
is
point.
fair. Right.
Yeah,
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 it's kind of so what, like hobbies, family, and work choose two,
yeah,
and
yeah,
like
yeah.
sleep is one, right?
Yeah, and these days, every hobby that I have, like I'm now getting so into like video editing, like podcasting, all this stuff. I'm just obsessed with it. I just want to like, that's all I want to do. So people around me are like, hey, you have to stop working sometime. I'm like, but if I don't do that, I'm unhappy. I actually just want to do this now.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah,
very obsessed always with this thing that I'm doing now, and I try to just embed it in the work aspect, and
yeah, for
that's
sure.
just the way I look at it. So you worked in that startup, still around. You were pretty much doing chief of staff, like which entails like a bunch of responsibilities.
Sure.
What was the next step after that?
Yeah, so I mean, I fell in love with startups, and I was like, man, if I'm in the space, I should check out Silicon Valley, right? I should spend some time there. And so I, put up my roots here, and I moved to San Francisco, and I was there for 3 years.
Nice.
Very interesting experience. So, like, what I would look, I mean, as much as I love Japan, I will say that, like, if you have the opportunity, if you're early career and there's nothing tying you down,
Mm,
I would highly recommend that a lot of people spend some time there, right? I will say that, like, the coming from Japan, going to San Francisco was um, one of the toughest professional experiences I've had, and
mm.
also one of the best ones, which is like I felt like I had to up level just through the process of interviewing and like trying to get
Can you
coffee
give more
chats
details on that?
with
Yeah.
startups. Yeah, so like long story short, I mean, I moved to San Francisco with like some modest savings and like no job, right? And I was like
I know the
crash.
savings are in Japanese yen as well.
Well, okay, the Japanese yen was a little bit stronger back then, right?
Can't remember those days.
It was like 107 or
Okay.
like 105 or like 110, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, but like, relatively modest, right? I'd only been working in Japan for like what, 2 years at that point,
Right.
right? So, moved to San Francisco, was sleeping on my brother's couch, and trying to find a job, right? And like, in contrast to my experiences in Japan, in which uh you you find yourself being highly differentiated
Hmm.
just by being multilingual, being able to access information in English, trying to create value by trying to interpreting like best practices and whatnot. Um, I had no such advantages in San
Because
Francisco.
everyone think like, because English is the main
Well,
language, and like,
English is the main language, and people are like so much better at the job. Like,
yeah.
I mean, forgive my French, but like, you went to Columbia, who gives a shit, right? There's like how many thousands of Ivy League graduates, and then you have
Yeah.
like Stanford down the street, and then you have like UC Berkeley, and people who have been doing this who are super hungry, super smart, have
Yeah.
been in the industry for years, right, at every single level. Um,
You are not that special,
you're not
basically.
that special,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
At all. And so
That's a good life lesson to go through,
it's a
though.
great life lesson, right? And it's like I think properly frames your perspective on where you stand in the grand scheme of things, right? It's like very much like, small pond versus big ocean.
Mm.
And I think most people who haven't spent time there don't fully recognize or understand how competitive it is, right? The US is the most competitive talent market in the world, right? You go on LinkedIn and you look at these jobs and you're like, product manager, 260 to 320K. Holy crap, right? But
Yeah.
it's like you don't understand like how hard it is to get those jobs. Right? And like oftentimes, like of course, like not everything's fair, the connection one, but generally speaking, you're like competing with like the top 1%
Yeah.
of people like globally in the industry, right? Um, so like I mean like it's a complete talent magnet for people around the world.
Yeah.
Um and so like I had like just as a specific example of this, like there were cases where I felt like I had to write like a full like 5-page go to market uh like kind of study for a company and like send it to like 10 people in an organization like just to get a coffee chat,
like a casual coffee chat,
Yeah,
not even an
right. And
interview.
of
Like,
course, like I wasn't very smart about it. People were like, "Oh, you should have just like reach out to investors, build a relationship with their investors, and then like gone an intro. Like that would have gotten you the job for sure, or like way easier, right?" But I
yeah,
mean, it's like I felt like it basically took that, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, different game, right? Like you just arrive and it's a different game, and like because in Japan, I mean,
Sure.
the fact that you do speak Japanese maybe it helps a little bit, but it took me a while, for example, also to understand like, okay, what can I do here that is actually valuable in Japan,
Yep.
and really understand like, okay, it's all about not blending in at this point.
Yep.
Like, don't fall into that trap because I've seen so many people try to blend in so much that is like, well, now you're just walking among the group and
Yeah.
you could be probably happier at home. Like, and but like in your case, like you go there, like, wow, nobody cares. I'm not special, and everyone goes for those super high paying jobs, I guess, and the competition is crazy. But like in the end, like you, how to say, you manage to land those interviews. And
I mean I like some people provide me with a lucky break, right? Interviewed with a lot of places. I think
how many like reach outs did you have to do to get a job?
hundreds,
Yeah.
right? Like easily,
And in Japan,
and
like
like
in
dozen.
comparison, like was like what?
I mean, like the hit rate is like a magnitude different, right? It's like 10x,
Yeah.
right? I'm like the way I would put it is like I mean just in terms of like how interesting you are to people,
Yeah.
like it's much easier to as a foreigner, right, to be interesting in Japan,
True.
right? And
Okay.
then there, I mean like you're much less interesting.
Mm.
Um And I mean, like the Japan stuff was like a curiosity. I think seems some people are like, oh, like that's kind of unusual,
Good
but like,
icebreaker. Yeah.
right? But like, how relevant is that really to their hiring criteria and like what they're looking for the specific
They
job?
didn't see like any value of like, oh, this guy worked, in a startup in Japan, like he's bringing that knowledge here. They didn't see it.
No,
They
no,
didn't
there was
care.
definitely value, right?
Yeah.
But I think this is kind of bridges over a broader discussion we have about Japan is
Mm.
that it is somewhat niche,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there are a few niche jobs in which Japan expertise is main selling point.
Mm.
But for the vast majority of jobs, that is not, right? When uh let's say like, when I was talking to a growth stage startup for a position on their international expansion team, I mean, yeah, they're like, "Oh, we've been kind of looking at Japan," right? They're also looking at like 5, 6 different markets, and they're going
Right.
to go to like the UK first. They're going to France. They're going to Germany. They're checking out Brazil. They're also if they're coming to APAC, they're looking at Singapore as a
Mm.
natural place to set up an APAC headquarters.
Yeah.
Right, like so, like what is Japan to them? It's an interesting kind of black box, big market, right?
Mm.
That like
But that's something you can bring to the table if you're able to, I guess. If,
theoretically, I mean, if the company is really pursuing it,
yeah.
um, yes, but they're also looking for more than that,
Yeah.
right? They're also looking for like um a significant layer of experience, right? And like subject area expertise. Like I mean, like as a random example, again, it's kind of like to get a product manager job. There, it's like even back then they were looking for like a couple of years of experience in a different role. So like either
Mm.
you were already a consultant with a couple of years under your belt, you were ex-engineer, knew how to do SQL for sure, right? Here it's like you see a lot of people without any of those experiences
Yeah.
uh getting PM jobs here, right?
Yeah. It's such a lack of talent, like in Japan. I mean, I see it from the recruitment lens.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Like people matching a job description is very rare. When I hire for startups, like you don't you need talent. Obviously, you
Yep.
need to be a strong engineer, but like startups often have to just say, okay, among those 5 6 requirements we have, we just focus on 2.
Yep.
And probably in the US it's the opposite, right? It's like
Yeah,
how
yeah,
much
they they
more
they
can
they
we
have their
get on
pick
top
of
of?
talent, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's the kind of thing where like, you see a job posting up for like 2 hours and there are 200 applications, right?
It's
I mean,
wild.
I don't want to like, play that up too much. But and what I will say is like what I think the value proposition of Japan to early career professionals in particular is that it
Hmm.
presents like a good on ramp into the world of tech and startups, right? Or even like venture capital if you're interested. Like it provides opportunities to people who like, you know, may not have gotten those opportunities in more competitive markets, right? And then you can
Right.
like build the experience here, you can build a track record here, and maybe you can take some of that and bring it elsewhere if you're
Yeah.
so inclined.
I guess maybe what happened to you as well, right? That chief of staff position you get here in Japan, maybe you will not get it in the US
Yeah,
right
no,
away.
I mean, basically impossible, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, like, not to knock myself, I think I'm like a reasonably, charming and conversationalist. But like, long story short, I interviewed with James at 500. Then he introed me to a couple of his portfolio companies. Then I had lunch with his CEO, and we had lunch and we talked for an hour. And on the way back from the lunch, he texted me and was like, "I want to work together." Right?
Wow.
How about this much money? Right? And I'm just like, oh, let me think about it. How about this much? Right? And then I was literally at work like the week after or like 2 weeks after on Monday. Right?
Yeah.
So like, I mean, I'm sure that happens in some places, but just like as like completely unproven, untested talent,
Yeah.
um, y- y- like good luck finding that kind of opportunity, right?
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, so I get what you mean. Like this is what Japan can offer is like that opportunity to get into a position where like you will not be able to get it in the US.
Yeah.
But you were talking about the fact that you'll recommend anyone here in Japan to also do what you did, right? You go to
Uh,
Silicon
well, well,
Valley and like
well, not necessarily. I think if you have the opportunity and you're early, I think it's worth spending some time there
mm,
if you want to get exposure to, what that level of competition looks like. I
yeah.
mean, I think in Silicon Valley they like using sports teams metaphors a lot, right? And so like they talk about like, oh, we're not a family like Netflix. They're like, we're not a family, we're a professional sports team, right?
Yeah.
Um, if Silicon Valley, right, is like the NBA, right, and you are a collegiate, or like high school basketball player, and you manage to spend some time with those people,
Yeah.
you
That
can
makes sense.
imagine that you learn a lot, right,
Yeah.
about the way they think, the way they communicate, some of the best practices, and just the degree of thoughtfulness some of these people put
Yeah.
into details of even the interviewing process are hugely like mind blowing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how careful they were and how thoughtful they were, how well these people could articulate every part of their business, going to the vision, to the feature level things, like how they would handle, complex, challenging situations, how they
Yeah.
could handle conflict in the organizations,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how they assess people. It was like I had never seen anything like that.
Yeah. Because passion is probably very strong as well, and the bar keeps going higher and higher, right? Because the competition is there, and so people just, I guess, it goes up.
So to be fair, I don't think that people are necessarily inherently that much smarter, right?
Yeah.
In a sense. Although I think that, just because of the function of like, getting the world's best talent there, right? You have
Yeah.
people who are world class and probably smarter than
Yeah.
almost anybody here. But I think most of the behavior and skill is just simply driven by competition,
Yeah, no,
right?
I
Yeah.
think it's in the environment, right? It's
Yeah.
just the environment. You put a bunch of people who are hungry for the same thing.
Yep.
You gotta climb higher
Yeah,
to
you
get
got to
it.
get
Like,
really good,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. Like, and I'm sure that's the thing, right? Like, where I'm sure, like in Japan, this can happen as well. Not necessarily maybe in the same with the same kind of image, but still the excellence and like people going like really quickly on improving and
Yep.
getting super good at stuff. Because if you bring more competition, you and people fight more for the same
Yeah.
things, right? Like,
I think it's two things, right? Like
mm,
fundamentally this is just a function of talent density, right? And talent density then feeds into increased heightened competition, but also an increase in role models, right? And people to learn from. It's like I strongly believe that it's basically impossible to become something that you've never seen before,
mm,
right? And we're all amalgamations of every single person we've interacted with
no, I
before
agree.
on some level, right? Like, uh, I openly admit to just frankly being a stochastic parrot of things I've read and people I've talked to, right?
Yeah.
There's not a single original thought in this noggin here.
Same, man.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
so
man. Yeah. No, absolutely. And this is the thing for me when I left the agency side. One of the issues that I was facing in the beginning was like, man, I'm just a recruiter. And then
sure,
I start meeting people like you, like Ilya, and all those people who start talking to me and sharing all this stuff. I'm like, wait, this doesn't seem crazy that I can be part of that conversation. I want to be, you know, talking more and more to those people. And now suddenly, like, yeah, I am, trying to help to grow the ecosystem and all those things. But it comes from, like you say, those people inspiring others, and it just, but you need to attract those people. And I feel like, so to go back just quickly to
sure,
to
yeah,
the to the US, like what did you learn that then you brought here, and then we can start talking real about the Japanese ecosystem.
sure. So, for context, when I was in the U.S., I had two primary roles, right? Obviously, you're still doing things on the side, and it was a little bit an interesting time because it was during the pandemic. But my first job there was as an associate at a firm called Silicon Foundry,
Okay.
which is now a part of AT Kearney, actually, or just Kearney, right? They dropped the AT. Um, I was essentially a corporate venture capital associate, where we helped Global 2000 companies figure out their innovation strategies, helped barter and negotiate and guide them through startup investments, commercial pilots, different kinds of collaborations, as well as helping educate different stakeholders internally. We sold ourselves on being a extension of their team,
Hmm.
right? Except one with a much more natural and expansive Silicon Valley network. And so some of the kinds of engagements that the firm would do would be things like, at the time we were working, for instance, with Ford, right? And so it would do something like bring Bill Ford, the chairman of Ford, to Silicon Valley, right? And then set up meetings between him and the founders of like Airbnb and like Beyond Meat and all these big startups, but also on the day-to-day side, right? I actually work with
In
their.
the hope that he will invest in those startups, like what is
I mean,
the
so that's like one of the things we did. It was like basically provide our network for these people who are outside of startups to have access to that, and
interesting,
try to break across silos. That was
right?
like a big thing, right? Is like which we'll get to in terms of like things that I learned. Was like try to be like curious and creative in the way that we tried to create value for people. One of the things that you realize very quickly is like there are all sorts of people that could work with each other,
Hmm.
but then naturally they don't know each other, and like we tend to settle in certain assumptions and patterns in who we associate with,
Right.
and that's a huge shame, right? And so we try to break that for our clients, and also like for the startups we'd be like, hey, we have this huge membership base of like a dozen plus corporates who are interested in working in startups. We just want to build a relationship with you, and if there's something that we think could like actually generate value for both sides, like we'd love to have you on our network and for us to
Mm.
intro you to our members.
I just want to go a little bit onto that because how do you guys monetize on that? How does it actually work? Because I don't see it as clearly as you do, but
Yeah.
like, what's the business model behind that? Because you just connect, and there's a lot of people out there that want to kind of do this stuff, right? But they never know how to monetize, and therefore they don't do it. But how does the business model work?
Yeah. So to be fair, is like more than connecting. We would actually like help execute deals
Mm.
and like startup investments for people and things like that. Like literally act like as an extension of their team. The business model itself was basically an annual membership as the core thing, right? It's
Okay.
like we we didn't sell projects, right? Like a typical consultant, and we stayed away from like the typical consulting language because we didn't want to make it a transactional relationship, right? We're like, okay, you've hired us, now we're, you know, together. And we know that for a corporate or a client to be successful in startups and startup investing and corporate innovation, etc., it's a long process, right? There's a
Mm.
lot of like internal education that has to happen. There's a lot of internal alignment that needs to happen. People need to figure out and learn what they need and what they want. Oftentimes, you have like a CVC or something that's spun out, and then it takes quite a few iterations to sharpen the angle, right, and the thesis around that. And so we would work on all of that.
Yeah.
and then help people accelerate their time to market,
Yeah.
because again, we
Yeah.
had a lot of these connections that
The
and
membership
relationships that
makes
they didn't
sense
have.
in that
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
do all those things if you're transactional because
Yeah.
how do you, so you guys become that extension.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, interesting company. Also, it's, still friends with them when I'm back in San Francisco, visit the office, chat with my old boss. A
Mm.
lot of the colleagues there have gone on to do like very interesting things since as well. And the second thing that I did there was I joined Moon Creative Lab,
Okay.
which is a venture studio affiliated with Mitsui and Co., which is a Japanese conglomerate, originally in collaboration with IDEO, right? The, I think, very renowned,
Yeah.
well-known design consultancy. Um, and there's an entire story behind that, but like, long story short, I loved the work I did at Silicon Foundry, I think, intellectually, but I still had a really soft spot in my heart for basically product and working on the startup side of things, and that felt like a good combination of the previous two experiences.
Like the venture
Yeah, kind
studio.
of the venture building, which is like corporate venture plus startups,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. So Moon Creative Lab, that was in Japan.
I
You
started
s-
in Palo Alto, actually. So
okay.
started
Interesting.
started in California. The first year or almost year and a half of my tenure there was in California, because I couldn't get into the country.
Yeah.
Right? It's like
Ah, it was
the like
COVID.
the
Yeah.
freaking
Yeah. It's
border
like
20, yeah,
2021.
so I couldn't get in here until 2022.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I moved back to Japan in May 2022. Also, like, I love San Francisco in a lot of ways, but it was also a tough place to live and justify living, especially during the pandemic, which is like,
Mm.
it's expensive. It felt kind of sketchy, right? It's like, it's not like there were any events going on anyway
Like the lockdown was
during,
really, really strict.
I, it was strict enough.
Because in Japan, I mean, I just remember my family in Belgium, they were like, I mean, they didn't go to a restaurant for about 2 years, I think, in a row,
Yeah,
which
like, I
is
mean, like, you
crazy.
couldn't eat indoors in San
Yeah.
Francisco, like, for a long time,
Yeah,
right?
Japan didn't go through this kind of I mean, I didn't feel it was
No.
bad, but it didn't feel that
No,
bad.
no,
Like,
no, no, in San Francisco. I mean, it's like it created this sense of anxiety, right,
yeah, yeah,
around
yeah,
everything, and like you were doing something wrong if you
yeah.
didn't follow the rules exactly, and like everybody, including myself, were watching like the COVID case counts every single day on
That's
Google.
so yes,
Like the baseline level of anxiety was
yeah.
terrible, right?
Which is terrible for someone like in your like you're a creative, right? You need to constantly think about new ways to be creative as well, and like anxiety is probably killing that as well to do a good job, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had my outlets. Like, I won a couple of trips, like, here and there, and got to spend a lot of time with family, which was good. My
Yeah,
brother has 3 kids, who I adore. Right, I get
nice.
to be the cool uncle.
Uncle
Right,
Kenneth.
yeah, Uncle Kenneth. Right, and I got to spend like every week with them and like watching cartoons and like whatever. Right,
Yeah.
so it's very close with them now, which I appreciate a lot.
Thanks to that time, basically.
Basically,
Yeah.
thanks to that time.
That's
Yeah,
good. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like I mean this whole period was pretty awful, but I kind of made the best out of it as
sure.
well. And like even the whole remote work, I was like, wait a minute, I'm starting a new career and I can work from home right away. I was like, great.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
saw so many actually good things. And I was lucky enough to focus on recruiting engineers all day long. And they were home all the time now.
Oh shoot, yeah,
So, it was like, and all those companies that I started working with, they couldn't hire from overseas anymore. So everything kind of lined up in a good way,
yeah,
career wise, and spent also more time with my wife. And so, because she was a teacher and the schools were shut as well for a while. And so, yeah, I remember going through that phase as well. Like, let's just make the best out of this.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And nice. But so basically, you came to Japan.
Came back to Japan in 2022. And had gotten to know a couple of people during the pandemic, like including like my friend Skylar, right? And so like upon coming back, like immediately starting to get involved in some of the startup community stuff, at least on the international community side of things, right? So like started helping out at different events, and then went to an event that was hosted by this very nascent small group of just a couple people called Startup Co-Creation,
Okay.
right? Which was one of the first groups like that started doing English language startup events after the pandemic. Um, Hit it off with it, started helping out, hit it off with the team, and they're like, "Oh, do you want to be a co-founder of this and like run with it?" I'm like, sounds great. Yeah, let's do it, right? And so it was like a motley crew. It was like, 5, 6 of us at the time, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. We did like 7 events in the first year and like had like hundreds of people go. We did like this Slack group, which I still run today. I
Yeah.
think the Slack group started with like what 30 people, and now it's like 510.
Yeah.
And like we haven't done anything with it since, and we can kind of dig into how hard it is to run a community and keep it going.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, no, it was an exciting new project. I was enjoying getting back into Japan after being gone for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Um, Moon provided like a very international workplace as well.
Mm.
Um,
Can you walk me through or walk us through the model of like a venture studio as well? Like, because this is not something that people
yeah.
fully understand. Like how does it work? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the best way to understand venture studios is in relation to venture capital. So classically, venture capital just provides investment capital, right?
Hmm.
Or like, working capital for the startups to grow. And then the operations of the company are left to the management team, right? In the case of a venture studio, there are two kinds typically, right? So instead of just providing capital, the venture studio also provides operating capacity to help incubate, build, and spin out startups, right? So when I say two kinds, typically there's one model in which the venture studio itself has a team of like, engineers, PMs, whatever,
Okay.
and then it actually builds the initial version of the product, validates it, does all these customer calls,
Like the
and
MVP kind of.
MVP
Yep.
exactly, right? They validate the market. Then they recruit like a CEO to come in and be like the founder or one of their co-founders, right?
Interesting.
Of the venture. The second kind is when they recruit the founders first,
Yeah.
and then they co-create the startup with them.
Okay.
So like famous examples of this include like Atomic, which
Yeah.
built startups like Hims and Hers. There's one called Science, I think built like a Dollar Shave Club back in the day. There's also very varying versions of this where some VCs have kind of leaned into this territory and like have like VC partners become the first CEO of this company.
Yeah.
Is like Sutter Hill Ventures and Snowflake
Okay.
is like another example. So it's a model that's been around for a while.
When it comes to like Y Combinator, for example, it's in the first.
It is not, right? So YC is an accelerator,
Okay.
right? So an accelerator is they don't have engineers that build people's product for them, right?
Okay.
What
That's
they
the
do is they
difference.
provide a network, they provide a platform, and they provide a lot of content in the form of lectures and
Yeah.
like a social community and like, mentorship, right? So like accelerators are fundamentally about community and about
Mm.
education, right? Venture studios are fundamentally about actually building the product. And like as in exchange for taking on that risk and taking on the say like salary cost of all the engineers and whatnot, they ask for more equity, right? So they
Makes
start with
sense.
more equity at the very beginning, kind of like a co-founder.
Yeah. What's
Yeah.
the equity usually that is? I mean, I'm sure it's case by case, but
Yeah,
like
it
roughly, like.
depends on a lot on the market, depends a lot on the firm, right? And so like this is actually a point of controversy
Hmm.
that the industry is trying to figure out right now, because if you get too much equity owned by a studio, right, early on, that might actually make it uninvestable to investors in later round
Mm,
because generally speaking you want the founding team or the management team to have like a certain percentage of equity, so they're like properly motivated and incentivized to like keep driving this to higher heights, right?
makes sense.
But to answer your question directly, right, like typically speaking their venture studio might take somewhere between 30 to 50% of equity, but that's like up to the replacing a seed, then maybe replacing up, replacing the pre-seed, then replacing a seed,
Yeah.
and then getting to like a Series A, right?
Interesting.
And the way it's structured, right, is like usually you have like the studio has equity, and then usually there might be a fund attached to the studio,
Yeah.
and so the studio gets equity at the very beginning, and then the fund invests like the equivalent of a
Mm,
seed to capitalize the startup, and then through that investment it gets like another 15 or 20 or 25%, or something like that, right?
Mm. Yeah, I can see the challenges of like, yeah, the model,
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Essentially, it's like it's a bet for the entrepreneur, right? Which is that the studio has to provide adequate value
yeah,
to be worth that much equity to, especially to experienced founders, right? It's like, if you're an experienced founders, why would you need somebody to take like a third of your company
yeah,
from
yeah,
the
exactly.
get-go, right? And so like, people are trying to address this tension. There are actually a couple of studios that manage to like attract really, really good experienced talent, um because they can, make a pitch and a value proposition that is strong
Mm.
enough to do that.
Mm.
But for in other cases, people are like, oh no, this is like not worth it at all, right? And then
Yeah,
you get like weaker founder talent as a result.
yeah. I was going. That's
Yeah,
kind of my immediate way of thinking is like either someone who really knows how to do it on their own and they go, or you attract the people who don't necessarily have the guts also to go all in on
yeah.
stuff, and they're probably not going to last for the whole journey anyway. And so you're kind of always like, how successful is this model in Japan? Like,
I think it's still being experimented with right now, right? So there are a couple of examples. There's like Delight Ventures, which actually was our client at Silicon Foundry, has like a venture builder program in which they stage out the validation process, right? So like the it's like, you have like 5 million yen for like this stage, right, where you do a bunch of interviews or whatnot, and then if the validation goes forward, then you move to the next stage and we give you this much money, and that's eventually leads to you like spinning out the entire project with
mm,
like this much of equity and whatnot. The I wouldn't say that I see any examples that like a blockbuster success,
yeah.
right? But there are people experimenting with this. Also, like, there's an organization kind of like Way Equity Partners that's like trying to build that,
We
and
we
they're
had Aki actually
yeah,
coming
sure, sure,
over as
sure,
well. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah, and they're trying to figure that out. There's also a couple of other folks who are
yeah.
trying to. I mean, like Moon, I think was one version of an attempt to put this in a corporate framework and do that. I think the folks at like Fujitsu Launchpad are trying to do something
Yeah,
fundamentally around. I mean, because like if you break it down in first principles, right, it's all about building a product, figuring out how to distribute it,
yeah.
and then
Find the right talent.
find the right talent to support the growth
Yeah,
of
yeah.
that one product. Like people did innovation in tech before there were modern
True.
day startups as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think so. Like, so basically, you left Moon Creative, and now you started your new job.
Correct. Yep.
And your current role is pure VC.
Actually, no, right? So, in my current role, I have two hats,
Yeah.
right? So the first hat is platform role. So I'm the quote unquote global platform lead, in which my role is to build up a series of different platform offerings, ecosystem offerings, and services for the company to support portfolio companies and also beyond,
Can
right?
you give me an example of like what does that mean, like the platform in that
Yeah.
case? Yeah.
So classically speaking, right, like venture capital firms, to make it more attractive for startups and entrepreneurs to work with them, have started providing different services to them, right? So like the easiest example of this is like you have a professional recruiter on hand, right, to help a lot of these startups do recruiting,
Mm.
right? You might provide a suite of SaaS discounts or different kinds of resources
Like
for
credits
them.
for AWS and
Yeah,
stuff.
credits for AWS, right? You might have a sales team or a international BD team to help them break into specific markets, right? You might have certain kinds of mentors like an expert network, right? You might do a lot of events that are theoretically value add in one way or another. In the case of Headline, like one classic example is, right, we host one of the biggest startup events, if not the biggest startup event in Japan, called IVS. And so like theoretically we could leverage that to provide distribution for a
Mm.
lot of the startups that we work with, right? It's like we put you on stage, we get you in front of 15,000 people and 100 reporters,
Yeah.
right? It's like, is that something that a startup can do easily by itself?
Yeah.
Maybe, but like, probably not, right? Especially when
Yeah.
they're really early on. And maybe like we can't solve all of your problems, but maybe we can make the process a little bit easier on you, or
Yeah.
like give you a little bit more jet fuel in your
Feels like
engine.
you're saving a lot of time as well
And
I
that's
feel
the
like that's the
idea,
main thing,
right?
right? So people don't burn out, you know,
Sure.
before they actually can really start working on the product, because all this stuff, like, you guys take help us with like all the paperwork and the incorporation, all this stuff as well a little bit, or
TBD on that. I mean, classically, no. So, like with Headline, we actually focus on pre-Series A, Series A. We also have a Launchpad fund that does like pre-seed seed, like very early checks. But generally speaking, I think Headline has a slogan which is like, "We help you win more."
Mm,
Right. So it's like, we're asking for some degree of product market fit. You already have a very, very real business. And then we can leverage a lot of these different resources, maybe our international network as a global VC firm to help you get reach or talent and whatnot
yeah.
easier or beyond what you would be able to do otherwise. Right.
So this sounds closer to maybe YC type of model in that sense.
It's on a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
But we don't run any time kind of limited. We don't run programs,
Okay.
right? It's like this is stuff that we do on a you know on demand basis or like on our own schedule
Yeah.
for the startups that we work with, or like aspirationally, right? So this is kind of a nascent function that I'm building out.
Yeah.
I also have a second role, which is like just investor, right? So like I am involved in the investment process, especially at the deal sourcing front, right? So if you're a startup, definitely come talk with me.
Yeah.
Happy to hear your
So that will
pitch.
be pre-seed, like very early stage.
No, also just like Series A.
Okay.
I mean, we do early stage generally, right? It's
Yeah.
just a question of like which vehicle you're a fit for,
Yeah. Yeah.
and where I can like send you.
Which hat you have to wear,
Right,
basically.
and like
Yeah.
which team I can send you to, right? For like what fund? Yeah.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about, I guess, Japan, and which challenges do you see right now? You're full into your role now. You want to be
Sure.
part of this whole growth of the ecosystem. Like, what are the challenges that you see these days, and what optimistic points do you also see? Because I mean, there's a lot of
Sure.
those venture studios that are growing. Like this, Japan seems to do a lot of things, at least with the right intentions.
Sure.
Like, what are what's your thoughts on that?
Where do we start? Do we want to start with like the good news, or do we want to start with the challenges?
The challenges.
Okay, let's start with the challenges. So kind of in the context of this conversation with Silicon Valley, right? Here's a question back to you.
Mm.
Why do you think Silicon Valley works?
One, language, first of all. Like,
Sure.
there's no language barrier.
Sure.
Engineers would make way more money.
Sure.
And there's an obsession with product.
Sure.
And yeah, that just attracts all the talent in the world.
Okay. So why are they able to make use of that talent?
I mean,
like, why do so many people immigrate there and like stay there?
yeah, I think the economics in general, like, I mean, the fact, for example, that engineers get a lot of the equity, and like, I look at it from my perspective here in
Yeah.
Japan, and I often see all those startups like barely giving equity to the engineers. That's one issue that I see, like, where people don't really care. Like, you will talk to engineers here, and it's like, oh, you're leaving this company, but you still have equity. It's like, yeah, but I don't care. Like, so the economics in general, like, an IPO doesn't mean the same here in Japan as it means in the US. So I feel like sticking around and working like crazy can truly change your life in the US.
Yeah.
In Silicon Valley.
So there's lots of, I think there's actually a lot to draw from in your answer. So I think generally speaking, like my experience, and this is a hot take for me, right? It's like if you start digging around the ecosystem, right? You come across a lot of these challenges and then these problems, which we can kind of articulate later on. But my personal take is that all of this kind of leads back to one issue, right? Which is a pretty fundamental issue that impacts like incentives that drive good or bad behavior across the entire board. So this factor, I think, is this concept called relational mobility.
Relational mobility.
Yeah. So have you ever heard this term
No.
before? So long story short, relational mobility is this concept kind of brought up, especially in the last 10 years in sociology, which is basically the measure of how easy it is to enter and exit social groups, right? And form new relationships versus and exit old social relationships, right?
Okay.
Um
Can you give me an example just to make sure?
so basically, I mean, just like how easy is it to make friends,
Right.
right? And how easy is it to leave one social group and then
Right.
enter another social group and be integrated as a member of that social group,
Makes sense.
right?
To have different kind of aspects like social groups,
Correct,
basically.
right?
Yeah.
So like kind of going back to the Silicon Valley example is like I think there's a lot to be said about the rapid turnover of people in Silicon Valley startups. So that also means that there's rapid sharing of best practices and cross-pollination of ways that people do things. If you fail in one circle or you piss certain people off, that's fine. You can go to another group of people, right? Who are also like, competing with each other on some level. And people also don't hold it as much against you, right? If you join one form or another. Like
Yeah.
if you dig in the history of Silicon Valley very early on, there is one specific thing on the regulatory and policy level that has helped relational mobility significantly. That was the uh, policy that made it impossible to enforce non-compete agreements, right? So if you go to like the history of like Fairchild Semiconductor, the Trader 7 or whatever, and these people splitting off from incumbents to start their own company, and the
Yeah.
incumbent not being able to sue them and whatnot, it basically created a culture and an ability for people to strike out their own path and also like incentivize and de-risk essentially like leaving companies, starting new companies, exchanging information. And my contention is that a lot of the things that you said, like for instance, Silicon Valley companies providing generous ESOPs,
Yeah.
come from that, right? Because you got to incentivize people to stay
Yeah.
financially if it's so easy to leave otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Then which also generates this positive flywheel in which these people get rich and then they also become angel investors or then they become founders, right? It also makes it such that people share information much more widely
Yeah.
on the internet, right? You have all these thought leaders, you have all these people trying to build their own platforms on an individual personal level, even beyond their companies,
Yeah.
right? Because it's portable, right?
Yeah.
And
Makes
so like
sense.
if we come to Japan, I think you can look this up. Uh in the study that I'm actually writing an article on this right now. But
Nice.
in a study of 39 countries in the world, Japan has the lowest relational mobility in the entire world, and it's not close.
Like people, I mean, yeah, the whole loyalty to your company and people. I mean, it's getting better, I guess. But
Yeah.
like people go to a company, they stay there for maybe their whole career, or like it's that
It's
aspect,
slowly
and
changing,
it
right?
is changing. Yeah.
But not to I and to be fair, I don't think it's a matter of like morality or whatever, anything like
Yeah.
ethics like that. I think there's a lot of pro-social behavior that people are incentivized to engage in if their relational mobility is high, right? Because I also think that it engenders a fundamental curiosity
Yeah.
in other people. Because you're always thinking like, oh, what could I do with this person, right?
Yeah.
And like, maybe we could work together in the future. Maybe there's something cool. And in a place where relational mobility is low, there is no opportunity to work with these people, not practically, right? I think over time that inculcates certain habits
Yeah.
and socialization
Yeah.
that make it very hard to work
Yeah.
cross silo, right, or cross group. And that's kind of what I would think like our biggest problem is, right? Is like
Mm.
there are all these silos with all these different groups,
Yeah.
and you notice this once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere. Like,
Yeah.
have you ever wondered why there are so many different payment rails and payment methods in Japan? Like, do we really need 25 digital payment rails, or like ways in Japan? Like, why does Shibuya City have its own payment system? Sorry, guys. Like,
Yeah.
no, but like seriously, I think
Yeah.
we really got to wonder why we have so many groups that reinvent the wheel, why we have so many conglomerates that have very unfocused product portfolios,
Yeah.
right? Why it's so hard for people to specialize as well, right? Because
Mm.
you can't go to other companies, so you just become a generalist, right?
Yeah, I mean, I see it like again, I see it even with the startups that I hired for, where like the HR department makes the job descriptions for the engineers they want to hire, but they don't talk to the actual hiring managers, and so and the hiring manager and the engineers don't talk to the business team, and so nobody really works together, and like you don't solve any problems. Like it kills creativity as well, right?
Yeah, like across the board, right? So like one of the interesting experience I've had is, again, not gonna name any names here, right? Is like, uh, I've gone to a couple of different groups of people, right? So one example was like country managers, in Japan, right? So country managers for international tech companies in Japan. Some of them are very enthusiastic actually about startups, right? Like, they
Mm.
used to work for XYZ startups and whatnot. And like, oh yeah, there's, definitely stuff that we'd love to do with like domestic startups. And then you ask them, has anybody ever reached out to you about this? You're like this wealth of knowledge and experience and connections. And they're like, no. Nobody's ever talked to us
Mm.
about this, right? You also like you never see anybody go from like a Stripe Japan or like a Square Japan or whatever to like a local startup. I've never seen it personally. I don't know if you have. Maybe you've seen more resumes than I've had, but like
Yeah, no,
I don't see
there is
anybody go
such
from
a gap.
Google,
Yeah,
right, or
yeah,
Rare.
yeah,
Not even like how many ex Microsoft people are there, or like all this other stuff, and like a couple. I think last year or something there was like event, um, featuring like the president of Grab, like
yeah,
the ride sharing unicorn in
yeah.
Southeast Asia, and he's just kind of. I asked him a question about this, and he was articulating how like there was this at some point this talent pipeline, right? Of like you had a bunch of international people come to Singapore through MNCs, then they get bored, then like, oh, why don't we join a
What's
startup or do a startup? And then so like you look at how many startups in Singapore are staffed or founded by people from those backgrounds.
yeah.
It's huge, right? I think in Japan we do such a poor job. I think because of these inclinations or the incentives and whatnot.
Mm.
So like there are very few people from say like U.S. university backgrounds working in domestic startups. They all work for McKinsey. They all work for Google. They all work for BCG or
Mm.
Goldman,
Yeah.
right? Maybe they work for Unilever. These are the kinds of people who
Yeah.
in most other countries would be in startups because it's
Mm.
the cool thing to do. Like their friends back at Stanford are working in this space.
True. Yeah. So social mobility is the issue.
Yeah, relational mobility,
Relational, sorry, yeah.
right? Is like
Relational
how do
mobility,
we form relationships with people, right?
yeah.
And I have to say that personally, like I've had to knock on so many different doors before I found somebody that was like I think kind of got this,
Yeah.
which is like there's always this kind of interesting dynamic where obviously people are polite, but then there seems to oftentimes be this wariness around strangers, right? Or like around like you got to build this relationship for a long time, you got to be accepted in this group, you've got to contort yourself into these different spaces
Yeah.
to to conform, then you gotta get accepted, and then maybe then you gotta do business, and then maybe then they'll share their networks, then they'll share
Yeah.
their experiences or whatnot with you. I think this is completely wrong, right? I think this is completely wrong. Not just because like I mean, from a business standpoint, like it's so much more if you're long-term focused and you're trying to play a quote unquote infinite game, you must have the imagination to think that these people
Mm.
that you work with all at some point almost habitually, right? Or you help
Yeah.
will will do something great down the road, right? And maybe you can do something great with them.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, it's funny because for even I look at it from my perspective as a headhunter, someone who meets people all day long. I do this for a living. I actually had that mentality of not really opening up my network because I lived through it, and I completely changed when I started my own agency because I was like, dude, it doesn't matter. Like it's actually good for people to know the people that I know because it just gets easier and easier. We all talk about the same things, But I can see how you get into that mindset of like not opening up your network to people
It's
and like,
hard, right? Again, I don't think it's like an ethical issue or like sorry, an ethical failing on the side of the individual, right?
yeah,
Necessarily, right? Necessarily. I think there are exceptions to this, right? But like I think it fundamentally inculcates a scarcity mindset,
yeah.
right? It's like I gotta own my people, right? I gotta own my relationships,
Yeah, and I feel like the person
right?
that actually has done a network, they worked so hard. They also feel like maybe the person that they want to connect or whatever, they might not be really happy about it. So they ask it in a certain way where the person is not really open to it. And like it's this circle, right, that you can't get out of because either everyone is, the way you are or I am, or like you just keep interconnecting people, or you're the other way where it's like you have to build relationships through time. Like it should take time. You cannot just connect and like
Right. Which I mean, to be fair, like I think that's why a lot of people who come in as community builders or like with this kind of more like open approach
yeah.
burn out,
Yeah.
right? Because you cannot keep running into brick walls
Yeah.
and not feel hurt
Yeah.
on some level, right? Where people may like, oh, you're only and interesting to them if you really prove your value to them, right? And like at some on a personal level, like I I don't like transactional relationships,
Yeah.
right? Um so there's something interesting, right? Which is like there was a the number of founders in Silicon Valley that have like founded companies people with people like coming from completely different backgrounds, right? I think there was a study that shows so again, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, right? But like, some people are like, oh, according to this chart, like India is a country with like relatively low relational mobility, but they have a lot of unicorns, right? So like, doesn't that kind of poke a hole in this and whatnot? But like, if you actually look at the numbers here, like India has something like 67 unicorns or something, right? Indians who moved to Silicon Valley have founded or co-founded like 100 plus unicorns
Wow.
with a much smaller base
Yeah.
and usually with people from a different kind of cultural ethnic background, right? Right. So how
Yeah.
like you have these cases where um again, I'm not gonna be like, oh, America rah rah, but I also think that it is not a coincidence that Silicon Valley is in California and not in New York
Right.
and not in Washington D.C., right? It's kind of very much like kind of this Wild West,
Yeah.
and you get to imagine what you might do together with people. Like you open yourself to the creative possibilities and to open yourself to being delighted by strangers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure the language barrier here is huge as well when it comes to it. Like, it is big part of also like that issue.
I think it contributes to it, but again, I'm oversimplifying. This is a highly multifactorial issues where with things reinforcing
Of
each other.
course.
But I would argue that like in this day and age, in 2024, right?
Yeah.
Like, is there really an excuse?
I mean, we had a meeting this morning with a client in Japanese, and I mean, my Japanese is awful. One is a little bit better than mine, but we still made it happen, you know. So no, it
No,
is
I mean
not
you
an
have like
excuse. Yeah.
translation software everywhere. Like
No,
this
exactly.
doesn't stop Koreans from going somewhere, or like people from China to going like international engineering conferences, right?
Yeah.
Like we're like I think this stems from a imagination issue and a question of curiosity
Yeah.
about other people that is reinforced and inculcated by certain social norms
Yeah.
and incentives that punish you, right? Or at certain points punish you, right, for
Yeah.
reaching across silos. And I think that's
Yeah.
like at the core of almost all of our problems in the Japanese startup ecosystem. Let's just go into the point. I mean, continue telling my rant, right? Like
Yeah.
the issue about like information flows. We're like, oh, like we don't know what's going outside the country. Like we have to rely on these people to like interpret things or like
Yeah.
translate things into Japanese. Like like why is it that like when in certain cases when we've brought like international speakers or whatever,
Yeah.
it's like I mean we have like very few people like who are outside the immediate circle of the organizers sign up for this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I remember when you and I met, you gave me so much information in literally like 30 minutes that I was like, I just remember asking you, like, why has nobody told me all of this? That was my reaction when I talked to you. I just remember this because it was the same feelings like, why nobody gave me this information before? I remember you connected me with some people, you put me on the Slack group, and it was the same feeling. And we have this all the time now as well. It's like, why is nobody actually sharing more information?
Right. All of this is like solvable issues, right?
Yeah.
Um, all of these are solvable issues, but I think it comes down to like the fundamental beliefs on how people should interact, right? And
Yeah.
again, I'm not somebody who leans into cultural essentialism. You know, I think a lot of that's bullshit, right? I think the individual differences are much larger than like national differences. But I will say that the inclinations here, and again, if you've seen these academic studies, it's you know magnitude of difference, right? It's like
Yeah.
standard deviation plus in terms of differences in standard behavior. um I think what you see is like, okay, so what this all comes down to is it makes it very hard for people who are new to get started,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what are startups about?
Yeah, yeah,
New
no,
people
like,
getting started with a new viewpoint, right?
yeah,
Insofar as relational mobility is low, what you're going to get is going to be things that are derivative from people who are already incumbent.
true. Yeah, man, like, I mean, again, I bring it back to us,
Sure.
InnoHyve, like, it took us so much time to figure out how to incorporate, and we are lucky because we have a network, so we could kind of help, like, get a lot of help from the people that know us. But I was like, if I came here and after a year I want to start my own company, there's no way on earth I can do that.
Yeah.
And it's like that's where I had the most kind of fire in me as well. Like that's where I had the most energy. That's where I had probably the most drive. And so I can imagine the graveyard of potential companies that could have happened if things were easier. Actually.
Yeah, like why is there still no single place where you can get all the answers?
Yeah,
Like I people still don't know
yeah,
what the best visa is to
yeah.
start a company with as a foreigner.
It's crazy. Yeah,
Like what the fuck? Like
yeah. No, no.
are you serious?
It's yeah. It's yeah. It's
Yeah,
insane.
yeah.
So where's the hope?
Anyway,
Where
anyway.
two follow
Sure,
questions.
sure.
What's your theory then? Like, why is Japan that way? Why is this relational like mobility an issue? Like, what's your theory on that? Like, what's the reason? If it's
I mean, look, I mean, there, the studies that I've read on this, and again, happy to link at some point, right? Which is like, you know, they want the sociology historical route of try to explain this phenomenon, which is like, oh, is it like, you know, people who like come from herding cultures versus like farming cultures, and the more farming it is, the more you require like a small village working in harmony and coordination,
right?
right? Versus, you know, like, you know, nomads or like, you know, herding. I'm not really sure about a lot of those specifics, but that's like one explanation for it, which is like fundamentally cultural historical reasons. I
Yeah,
mean, another reason for that is like, you know, you have countries that are like countries of immigrants, right, where you have a lot of people still living side by side naturally. There's a self-selection issue, which is like there's a lot of people who have fundamentally removed themselves from their original social context to join a new one, and then, you know, the
mm,
culture that stems from that on one hand. um there's also like, you know, countries where like people are just much more familiar with working with people from a different
yeah,
kinds of social backgrounds or cultural backgrounds because they're in and out, right? So think of like a lot of the countries in Europe, right? Naturally speaking, you're gonna have people from all different kinds of ethnicities and
yeah,
linguistic backgrounds, even in the same country, right?
yeah,
And that becomes a part of their day to day. I think one last thought I have is like, you know, this is a longer conversation to have, but I think a lot of it has to do with the self conception of a society or a nation,
mm,
right? You know, there's the idea that kind of drawing from my international relations background, in that like all countries are imagined communities, right? In which like, you know, we believe that we have some sort of connection with somebody who has the same passport with us.
Right.
Like for some reason, right? We've
Yeah.
never met them before. We might think completely different things, but somehow we're on the same team and we belong to the same community. Because like I was born within
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
700 miles of them, and we have a piece of paper that looks like about the same.
Yeah.
So like I think in Japan, the magic community is has a very particular definition of itself, right? And it's one that people are trained in and educated with
Yeah.
from a pretty early age. Right?
Yeah, like I mean, this conversation is something I have with my wife. Like, it's like as soon as like my daughter, we want to send her overseas as soon as we can, like because I just know how I think is so different, and like my wife is completely different from her family as well. Like her family is from Nagano, like Karawizawa, and my wife went to live abroad for a couple of years, and she came back. I was like, wait a minute, this is not, this is not anymore how I want to think.
Yep.
And so yeah, so what's the hope here? What's the positive thing that you see? And like, because you're working your ass off every day for the ecosystem, it's because you see things moving somehow towards the right direction, right?
So I think there are three things, and let's split it into two parts, right? One is like bright spots and opportunities, and second thing is like what we can do about it, right? To be action oriented here. So the first bit is like I'm sure maybe you've heard it in other places, which is like, hey, Japan is an investable market for the first time in a decade plus 2-3 decades, right? It's like
Yeah.
stock market at historic highs. There's a lot of international capital flowing into this because of geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China. There's also a lot of interest coming in from other interesting quarters like Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia has traditionally has had a dearth of exits and therefore liquidity. And so, some of these startups are starting to look at markets like Japan, which provide a pathway to liquidity, right? With a actually active and very healthy stock market in a lot of ways. I think we're also hitting a high point in Japanese soft power, right? So like a lot of people are fascinated with Japan on at least a personal level, right? It's like, I have rarely met somebody in Silicon Valley who, there was a joke, right? Which is like people are either planning to go to Japan, are
Yeah.
in Japan, or just went to
I
Japan,
mean, tourism is
right?
booming right now. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
and it's totally true. And there's a specific percentage of people, and I think Sakana AI makes a case for this as well, which is like you have a certain percentage of top talent that would love to live in Asia.
Yeah.
And so if there are companies that can leverage that and provide the right environment for them, for these very smart, ambitious people to work in, it works.